The Appalachian blizzard didn't care that she was 78, shivering in a threadbare coat, or fading fast. Beneath the roots of a skeletal oak tree, an elderly woman and her dog lay huddled together, nearly buried by the relentless snow in the heart of a killing forest. In the valley below, every window was lit and every home was warm, but up here, death was the only companion, until a searing beam of light cut through the whiteout, the flashlight of a man who had sworn to let the world burn without him. Inside lived a former Army Ranger who had shut himself off from humanity after losing everything. Finding her under that tree would pull him back into a world of danger, corporate greed, and a fight for justice that no one expected. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories of compassion and faith. The Appalachian winter of West Virginia did not arrive with a whisper. It descended like a heavy, suffocating shroud of iron and ice. In the small, isolated town of Maple Creek, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning pine and the looming dread of a century storm. By late afternoon, the sky had bruised into a deep, sickly purple, and the wind began to howl through the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, a sound like 1,000 starving wolves. This was not the picturesque snowfall of a Christmas card. It was a violent, abrasive assault that turned the air into a swirling vortex of white needles, erasing the horizon and burying the winding mountain roads under feet of treacherous, shifting powder. The temperature plummeted with a ruthless speed, turning breath into crystalline mist and making the very timber of the few scattered cabins groan under the sudden, agonizing contraction of the cold. High above the town's flickering, desperate lights, Elijah Stone Vance stood on the porch of his hand-hewn log cabin, a structure as rugged and unyielding as the man himself. Elijah was 38, a man built from the hard geometry of survival and the disciplined density of an Army Ranger. He stood 6'2", his frame broad-shouldered and lean, possessing the kind of functional musculature that came from years of mountain rucking and tactical maneuvers rather than the vanity of a gym. His face was a map of unspoken history, defined by a sharp, architectural jawline and high cheekbones that seemed carved from the local granite. A dense dark beard, now flecked with premature silver and crystalline frost, covered his lower face, yet it couldn't hide the tension in his mouth. His hair was a midnight black, buzzed short in a practical military fade that emphasized the intensity of his eyes, piercing steel-blue orbs that held the distant, haunted look of a man who had seen the world break and hadn't quite figured out how to put his own piece of it back together. He wore a heavy, wax canvas hunting jacket in a deep moss green over a thick charcoal thermal, his legs encased in rugged tactical trousers tucked into well-worn blackened leather combat boots. A faded, jagged scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone, a permanent souvenir from a night in the Korengal Valley that had claimed his best bandhun and left Elijah with a soul-deep silence that most people in town mistook for hostility. Elijah checked the tension on the storm shutters, his movements precise and economical. He had retreated to these mountains to escape the noise of a society he no longer understood, seeking a life where the only variables were the weather and the woodpile. But as the wind surged, a sound cut through the kill. Not the screech of a branch, but a low, guttural whine that vibrated against his very marrow. He froze, his tactical instincts, honed in the shadows of Afghanistan, overriding the numbness of the cold. Reaching for the high-intensity LED flashlight clipped to his belt, he cast a searing beam of white light into the swirling abyss of the forest. The light danced off the trunks of massive hemlocks until it caught a flash of amber, the reflective glint of an animal's eyes. Trudging into the knee-deep snow, Elijah followed the sound toward a gargantuan, hollowed-out oak tree that stood like a sentinel at the edge of his clearing. There, huddled within the gnarled roots, he found them. It was a sight that momentarily paralyzed his heart. A German Malinois, immense and powerful, even in its state of exhaustion, stood guard over a small, shivering form. The dog, Cade, was a magnificent specimen of his breed, approximately 8 years old, with a coat the color of toasted mahogany and a stark black mask that made his intelligent amber eyes pop with a fierce, protective light. His ears were erect, twitching toward every snap of the wind, though his front left shoulder bore a jagged, silvered scar that caused him to favor his right side, a mark of a previous life spent in service, perhaps as a K-9 unit. He didn't growl at Elijah. Instead, he let out a sharp, urgent huff of steam, nudging the bundle of rags behind him. Nesting in the frozen mulch was Maeve Whisper O'Connell. At 78, she looked as fragile as a bird caught in a gale, her tiny frame seemingly held together only by the sheer force of her remaining spirit. Her face was a delicate lace of deep-set wrinkles, her skin as pale and translucent as parchment, yet her eyes, a striking, intelligent emerald green, remained sharp even as her body failed her. Her silver-white hair had escaped its neat braid, whipping around her face like silk threads. She was dressed in a threadbare, moth-eaten wool coat that offered no defense against the sub-zero reality of the Appalachian night, her hands claw-like and blue-tinged as she gripped Cade's thick fur. "Ma'am?" Elijah's voice was a low rumble, rusty from days of disuse. He knelt, the snow crunching loudly under his weight. Maeve looked up, her teeth chattering with a rhythmic, violent click. He wouldn't leave me," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a Celtic lilt. "Cade, he found the tree." Elijah didn't hesitate. The internal walls he had built to keep the world out didn't just crack. They vanished under the weight of a sudden, undeniable responsibility. He saw in Maeve the echo of his own mother, a woman who had taught him that the measure of a man was found in what he did when the world was at its darkest. He saw in Cade the loyalty of the brothers he had lost in the sand. "I've got you," Elijah grunted, his breath billowing like dragon smoke. He tucked the flashlight into his jacket and reached out. With a strength born of necessity, he slid one arm beneath Maeve's knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she were made of dry leaves. She was dangerously light, her core temperature clearly plummeting. Cade rose. Instantly, his movement stiff and pained as he favored his scarred shoulder, but his gaze never left the woman in Elijah's arms. The walk back to the cabin was a brutal gauntlet. The wind tried to knock them flat, and the snow blinded them, but Elijah moved with the unwavering focus of a man on a recovery mission. Cade pressed against Elijah's thigh, his massive body acting as a windbreak for the man's legs, the two of them moving as a single, desperate unit through the whiteout. When they finally burst through the cabin door, the sudden transition to the still, warm air was almost painful. Elijah kicked the door shut and bolted it against the screaming night. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, laying Maeve down on the oversized leather sofa he had positioned near the massive stone hearth. The fire within was a roaring orange beast, casting long, dancing shadows against the cedar-planked walls. "Stay with her, Cade," Elijah commanded. The dog didn't need the order. He immediately collapsed onto the rug beside the sofa, his head resting on Maeve's feet, his amber eyes watching Elijah with a profound, weary gratitude. As Elijah moved to the kitchen to prepare a pot of broth, his hands, usually as steady as a sniper's, trembled slightly. He looked at the old woman shivering under his blankets and the scarred dog guarding her. For years, he had convinced himself that he was finished with the world, that he had no more protection to give. But as the storm thrashed against the logs of his home, Elijah Vance realized that the mountain hadn't brought him a burden. It had brought him a reason to wake up. The silence of the cabin was gone, replaced by the shallow, ragged breathing of a stranger and the rhythmic thumping of a dog's tail against the floorboards. The war outside was just beginning, but for the first time in a decade, Elijah wasn't fighting for himself. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with the smell of damp wool and the savory, salt-heavy aroma of chicken broth simmering on the cast-iron stove. The orange glow from the hearth danced across the rugged interior, reflecting off the glass of framed maps and military commendations that Elijah usually kept obscured in the shadows. Maeve lay tucked beneath a heavy Hudson Bay wool blanket, her shivering finally subsiding into a rhythmic, exhausted trembling. Her emerald eyes, though clouded by fatigue, tracked Elijah's every movement as he worked with a practiced surgical efficiency. He moved through the small kitchen area, his heavy boots muted by the woven rugs, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he poured the golden liquid into a ceramic mug. Beside the sofa, Cade remained a silent, watchful sentinel. The Malinois had begun to dry off, his mahogany fur fluffing up to reveal the powerful musculature of a working breed. He licked a paw, his amber eyes never leaving. Maeve, occasionally glancing at Elijah with a look that seemed to evaluate the man's intent. Elijah knelt by the sofa, offering the mug. "Small sips, ma'am. Your system is still in shock." He watched her thin, blue-veined hands wrap around the warmth of the ceramic. As she drank, the color began to bleed back into her sallow cheeks, a faint pink hue returning to the parchment-like skin. Elijah settled into a heavy oak chair opposite her, his elbows resting on his knees, his steel blue eyes searching hers. "You're a long way from the valley road, Maeve. No one survives a night under that oak tree without a reason for being there in the first place. Why were you out in the whiteout?" Maeve set the mug down on a low side table, her fingers tracing the rim. She looked at Cade, then back at Elijah, a sudden, sharp clarity piercing through her weariness. "It wasn't the storm that drove me out, Mr. Vance," she began, her voice gaining a brittle strength. "It was the paper. It's amazing how something as thin as a sheet of bond paper can weigh more than a mountain." She reached into the deep, tattered pocket of her wool coat and pulled out a damp, crumpled envelope. The corner was stamped with a stark, professional logo, a stylized pine tree inside a circle, the words "Evergreen Properties" embossed in a cold, corporate green. Elijah's jaw tightened, the muscles along his sharp jawline flaring. He took the envelope, his thumb brushing over the logo. Inside, the letter was a clinical masterpiece of legal aggression, a notice of final foreclosure and immediate eviction. "I know this name," Elijah muttered, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "They've been buying up timber rights near the ridge, but you're on an old land grant, Maeve. They shouldn't be able to touch your deed." "That's what I thought," Maeve whispered, a tear tracing a path through the deep lace of wrinkles on her cheek. "Last spring, after the heavy rains, my roof started to fail. I'm a retired schoolteacher, Mr. Vance. My pension is a fixed thing, as immutable as the seasons. A man came to my door, smooth-talking, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He said he worked for a nonprofit outreach program associated with Evergreen. He offered a community restoration loan. No interest for 5 years, he said. Just sign here to secure the materials. I was tired of the buckets on the floor, tired of the damp. I signed." She let out a ragged, hollow laugh. 2 months later, the nonprofit was absorbed by the parent company. The no-interest clause vanished in a labyrinth of fine print I hadn't seen, replaced by an adjustable rate that swallowed my savings in a single season. When I couldn't pay the new premium, they didn't send a letter. They sent men. As Maeve spoke, Elijah's mind drifted to the only other person he trusted in the valley, a man who lived 5 miles down the ridge. This was Caleb Thorne, a man who had become a reluctant mentor to Elijah when he first arrived. Caleb was 65, a retired structural engineer who had turned to blacksmithing to keep his hands busy. He was a man of iron and ash, with hair like tangled wire, and a beard that reached his chest, stained with the soot of his forge. Caleb had a cynical view of progress, but a heart that beat for the old ways of the mountain. He had warned Elijah months ago about suit-and-tie predators circling the town, but Elijah had been too buried in his own ghosts to listen. Now, the reality was sitting on his sofa, shivering. Cade suddenly let out a low, vibrating growl, his hackles rising in a stiff ridge along his spine. He wasn't looking at Elijah, he was staring at the door. Elijah was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively reaching for the tactical knife clipped to his belt before he checked himself. He crossed the room silently, his shadow stretching long and menacing against the walls. He peered through the narrow window beside the door. Outside, the blizzard was a wall of white, but through the swirling chaos, a rhythmic, unnatural flash of light caught his eye. It was the sweep of a high-powered spotlight, cutting through the trees from the access road below. A dark, heavy-duty vehicle was idling near the trailhead, a black Ford 50 with darkened windows, its engine a low, predatory thrum that even the wind couldn't fully drown out. "They're looking for you," Elijah said, his voice as cold as the frost on the glass. He turned to Maeve, seeing the raw terror in her emerald eyes. "They didn't expect you to survive the night. They wanted the storm to do their dirty work so they could claim the property without a witness." Maeve gripped the blanket, her knuckles white. "They want the ridge, Mr. Vance. It's not about my little house. It's about the access to the old logging tunnels beneath it." Elijah walked back to her, his presence filling the small room with a sense of grim military resolve. He looked at the letter in his hand, then at the scarred dog and the broken woman. The stone Vance who had come to this mountain to die in silence was gone. The man who remained was a ranger, and he had just identified the enemy. He leaned over and stoked the fire, the sparks flying upward like tiny, defiant stars. "They won't find you tonight," Elijah promised, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that brooked no argument. "The storm is my territory, and tomorrow we're going to find out exactly how much that paper is worth when it's held up to the light." Cade settled back down, but his ears remained pricked, swiveling toward the door. Elijah sat back in his chair, not to sleep, but to plan. He reached out and placed a large hand on Cade's head. The dog didn't flinch, instead leaning into the contact. In the silence of the Appalachian night, between the roar of the fire and the scream of the wind, a new alliance had been forged in the crucible of a shared injustice. The dawn did not bring clarity. It brought a heavy, claustrophobic fog that clung to the snow-heavy hemlocks like a wet woolen blanket. The blizzard had transitioned into a steady, silent fall of fat flakes that muffled the world, turning the Appalachian ridges into a labyrinth of white and gray. Inside the cabin, Elijah Vance was already moving. He had traded his sleep for a focused, tactical preparation. He checked the action of his sidearm and slid a serrated survival knife into his boot, a grim necessity for a trip into a town that felt more like enemy territory with every passing hour. Maeve sat at the small wooden table, her silver hair pulled back into a tight, dignified bun, her emerald eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and newfound hope. Cade, sensing the shift in energy, paced the length of the room, his nails clicking rhythmically against the floor, his ears swiveling toward the frost-covered door. By mid-morning, the engine of Elijah's '94 Toyota Land Cruiser, vehicle more tank than car, grunted to life, its exhaust plume white and thick in the freezing air. Maeve was bundled in Elijah's oversized wool parka, looking like a child lost in a sea of Gore-Tex, while Cade occupied the rear, his head resting alertly on the middle console. The drive down the mountain was a grueling descent through knee-deep drifts. Elijah steered with one hand, his eyes scanning the tree line for the black Ford F-150 from the night before, but the forest remained a wall of indifferent timber. As they rolled into the outskirts of Maple Creek, the town looked exhausted. The few residents out shoveling snow moved with a sluggish, defeated cadence, their eyes downcast. The charm of the mountain village had been replaced by a palpable tension, a corporate chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Elijah parked in front of Miller's Pharmacy, a brick-faced relic that served as the town's social hub. He needed supplies for Maeve, antibiotics for her rattling, cough, and high-calorie rations. As they stepped out, the bell above the pharmacy door rang with a shrill, unwelcome tone. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and old paper greeted them. At the back of the store, leaning against a rack of greeting cards, was the man who had occupied Elijah's suspicions for weeks. This was Silas the Hound Thorne. Silas was a man in his late 30s who carried himself with the predatory grace of someone paid to be a problem. He was tall and rangy, his frame hidden beneath a high-end obsidian black tactical jacket. His face was a collection of sharp, unkind angles, a hawk-like nose, a thin-lipped mouth that seemed frozen in a permanent sneer, and a goatee trimmed with such mathematical precision it felt unnatural. His eyes were the color of cold tea, devoid of empathy, and a jagged scar, puckered and white, traced the line of his jaw. Silas was a former private contractor, a man who had traded a uniform for a corporate paycheck and his reputation in you. The valley was one of quiet, efficient intimidation. Silas straightened as Elijah and Maeve approached the counter, his tea-colored eyes locking onto the old woman with a terrifying intensity. "Mrs. O'Connell," Silas said, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that made the hair on Elijah's neck stand up. "We were quite concerned. The storm was unforgiving. Most folks your age wouldn't have made it to the main road." His gaze shifted to Elijah, measuring the man's broad shoulders and the hard set of his jaw. "And you must be the hermit from the ridge. Vance, right? I didn't take you for a good Samaritan." Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself like a shield between Silas and Maeve. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, a tactic learned in interrogation rooms. "She's under my roof now, Silas," Elijah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "which means she's under my protection. If you or any of your evergreen boys come sniffing around my trailhead again, you'll find out exactly how I feel about trespassers." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Protection is an expensive hobby, Vance, especially when it involves a property that legally no longer belongs to the occupant. You're playing a losing hand." He turned to leave, but as he passed, he leaned in closer to Elijah, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The mountain is big, but it's not big enough to hide an old woman forever. Eventually, the snow melts." As Silas exited, the tension in the room dissipated only slightly. From the shadows of the pharmacy's office, a woman emerged. This was Chief Elena Rodriguez. At 45, Elena was the first female police chief in Maple Creek's history. She was a woman of solid build, her dark hair kept in a functional ponytail, her face bearing the weary lines of someone who had spent 2 decades trying to keep the peace in a place that didn't always want it. She wore her uniform with a crisp, no-nonsense authority, but her dark eyes held a flicker of genuine concern. Elena was a widow of a soldier, a fact that gave her a silent, mutual respect with Elijah. She had seen the way Evergreen Properties was eroding the town, but her hands were often tied by the very legalities Silas manipulated. "He's not bluffing, Elijah," Elena said, her voice quiet as she leaned against the counter. She nodded to Maeve, a gesture of respect. "Evergreen has the deeds, the lawyers, and half the town council in their pocket. They're looking for any excuse to label you as a kidnapper or a squatter." She glanced toward the window where Silas's black truck was pulling away. "If you're going to fight them, you can't do it from a cabin. You need something they can't buy. You need the original land grant Maeve's grandfather signed. Word is, it was never filed in the county office. It was kept in the old vault at the town's historical society." Elena's eyes met Elijah's, a silent warning passing between them. "The historical society is currently closed for renovations by order of Evergreen's parent company. They're planning to gut the place by the end of the week." Elijah nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Thanks, Elena." He grabbed the medicine and ushered Maeve back toward the Land Cruiser. Cade was already at the window, his teeth bared in a silent snarl, as Silas's truck disappeared around the corner. The line had been crossed. The corporate predators had a face now, and Elijah Vance had a target. As they drove back toward the safety of the mountain, the fog seemed to thicken, but for the first time in a decade, Elijah saw his path with perfect, terrifying clarity. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was going to war for a woman who reminded him of everything worth saving. The return to the ridge was an exercise in silent, mounting dread. As the Land Cruiser climbed the Serpentine Mountain Pass, the suspension groaning against the frozen ruts, Elijah felt the phantom weight of Silas Thorne's gaze still burning into the back of his neck. The interior of the vehicle was silent, save for the rhythmic, wet rasp of Maeve's breathing and the low, guttural hum of the engine. Cade stood with his paws braced against the rear seats, his black mask snout twitching as he sampled the air through the slightly cracked window. The dog knew what Elijah knew. The encounter at the pharmacy hadn't been a warning, it had been a declaration of intent. The forest around them felt transformed, the ancient pines no longer appearing as stoic guardians, but as potential cover for the black-clad shadows of Evergreen's reclamation team. By the time the cabin's silhouette emerged through the gathering dusk, Elijah was already in a state of high-alert tactical immersion. He didn't park in his usual spot. Instead, he tucked the vehicle into a dense thicket of spruce 100 yards from the trailhead, camouflaging it with a heavy white tarp. He moved with a liquid grace, helping Maeve through the deep snow, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter. Inside, the cabin was cold, the fire having died down to a bed of gray ash. While Maeve rested, Elijah didn't reach for the woodbox. He reached for a heavy olive-drab Pelican case stashed beneath his cot. He began to deploy a series of motion-activated thermal sensors around the perimeter, his movements a blur of practiced muscle memory. He wasn't just a hermit anymore. He was a commander fortifying a fire base. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, a low, persistent vibration rattled the cabin's single window. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the porch. Cade was at the door in an instant, his hackles rising into a razor-sharp ridge, a low, bone-chilling snarl vibrating deep in his chest. Elijah didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the door handle, flinging it open to reveal a figure that seemed to have been birthed from the mountain itself. This was Boone Bear Halloway. At 62, Boone was a man who looked like a weathered stump of cedar. He was broad, not with the gym-sculpted lines of Elijah, but with a thick, barrel-chested density that came from 40 years of felling timber. His face was a landscape of deep-set furrows, his skin the color of cured leather, and his beard was a chaotic, snow-dusted thicket of iron gray that reached his sternum. His eyes, a startling, clear hazel, possessed a wild, untamed intelligence. Boone was a man of few words and even fewer friends, a mountain man who lived by a code of silence that even Elijah respected. He carried a heavy, double-bitted felling axe over his shoulder like a toothpick. "They're coming, Vance," Boone said, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to come from his boots. He didn't ask for permission to enter, he simply stepped over the threshold, the scent of wood smoke and damp fur following him. 3 of them, black coats, moving up the old logging flume. They ain't hikers. Boone's arrival wasn't a social call. It was a warning from the only other man who knew the secret paths of the ridge. He had watched Evergreen's men move from his own hidden vantage point, and his presence here was a testament to the quiet brotherhood of the mountain. Elijah nodded, his steel blue eyes narrowing. Maeve, stay in the cellar crawl space. Boone, if you're staying, watch the rear porch. I'll take the tree line. The cabin, once a sanctuary of isolation, was now a trap. Elijah stepped back out into the freezing night, Cade at his heel. The snow had stopped, leaving the world in a terrifying crystalline silence. He moved toward the large oak tree where he had first found Maeve, his white camouflage overjacket making him invisible against the drifts. He didn't have to wait long. From the direction of the logging flume, 3 figures emerged. They moved with a clumsy, arrogant confidence, their high-powered flashlights sweeping the forest like searchlights. They were Silas's men, the reclamation team, sent to ensure the old woman didn't survive to see the Historical Society's files. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Elijah clicked a remote in his pocket. A series of small, blinding strobe lights he'd rigged to the hemlocks erupted in a chaotic, disorienting pulse. The men stumbled, shielding their eyes, their shouts of confusion muffled by the thick snow. That was the opening Elijah needed. He didn't use a weapon, he used the environment. He moved like a ghost, appearing behind the first man and using a swift, non-lethal pressure point strike to the neck that sent the intruder sprawling into the powder. Cade was a blur of mahogany fur, not biting, but using his sheer mass to shoulder charge the second man, knocking the breath out of him and pinning him into a snowbank with a terrifying, bared teeth display of dominance. The third man, younger and panicked, pulled a collapsible baton, swinging wildly at the shadows. Elijah stepped into the man's guard, his movement a masterclass in close-quarters combat. He seized the man's wrist, twisted, and swept his legs in one fluid motion. The intruder hit the ground hard, his face buried in the freezing crust. Elijah knelt over him, his voice a terrifying, quiet whisper. Tell Silas that the mountain doesn't belong to Evergreen. It belongs to those who know how to survive it. If I see any of you on this ridge again, you won't be walking back down. He watched as the 3 men, broken and terrified, scrambled back toward the logging flume. Their bravado evaporated in the face of a professional they couldn't see. Elijah stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving, the cold air burning his lungs. Cade returned to his side, his amber eyes shining with a fierce, satisfied light. The skirmish was won, but the war was escalating. Inside the cabin, Boone stood guard over Maeve, his axe resting against the table. The Brotherhood of the Ridge had held the line, but Elijah knew Silas wouldn't take this defeat lightly. As he walked back toward the amber light of his home, he realized that the files in the Historical Society were no longer just a legal hope. They were the only way to end the cycle of violence before the mountain claimed more than just the deeds. The aftermath of the skirmish left the ridge in a state of vibrating tension, the silence now feeling like a coiled spring. Elijah Vance didn't wait for the adrenaline to fade. He knew that by forcing Silas's men into a humiliating retreat, he had accelerated the timeline. The renovations at the Maple Creek Historical Society were no longer just a corporate excuse. They were a death sentence for the evidence Maeve so desperately needed. By 3 a.m, leaving Maeve under the stoic, axe-wielding protection of Boone Bear Halloway, Elijah slipped back down the mountain. This time, he didn't take the Land Cruiser. He moved on foot, a shadow among shadows, utilizing an old deer trail that bypassed the main access roads where Silas's black F-150s were likely patrolling. Beside him, Cade moved with an eerie, disciplined silence. The Malinois' mahogany coat blending into the dark timber, his sensitive ears tracking the distant hum of the town's generators. Maple Creek's town square was a ghost of its former self under the orange sodium lamps. The Historical Society, a stately 2-story Victorian building with peeling white paint, was encased in a shroud of green construction mesh and yellow "Keep Out" tape. As Elijah reached the alleyway behind the building, he realized he wasn't the only one interested in the vault. Huddled near the basement egress was a figure in a heavy, charcoal-colored parka, fumbling with a professional-grade camera and a set of lockpicks. This was Cassian Cass Hayes. At 28, Cassian was a whirlwind of nervous energy and sharp intellect. She was slender and wiry, her movements quick and bird-like. Her face was heart-shaped, dominated by oversized, thick-rimmed glasses that slid down her nose, and her hair was a messy nest of auburn curls escaping from a knit beanie. Cassian was an investigative journalist for a dying regional paper, a woman who lived on black coffee and the obsessive pursuit of the story that matters. She had been digging into evergreen properties for 6 months, her interest sparked by the suspicious disappearance of public records following her own father's forced retirement from the county clerk's office. Cade let out a low, barely audible huff, causing Cassian to jump and nearly drop her camera. She froze as Elijah emerged from the fog, his steel blue eyes pinning her to the brick wall. "You're Vance," she whispered, her voice a mix of terror and excitement. "The ranger from the ridge. Chief Rodriguez said you might show up." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He assessed her with a cold, tactical gaze. He saw the press badge tucked under her collar and the genuine, unblinking resolve in her eyes. She wasn't an operative. She was a witness. He signaled for her to stay quiet and, with a single practiced twist of his multi-tool, bypassed the rusted lock on the basement door. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of damp stone, rotting paper, and the sharp, chemical tang of fresh paint used to cover up the building's decay. They moved through the basement with surgical precision, Elijah's high-intensity flashlight cutting thin ribbons through the dust-choked air. Cassian followed in his wake, her camera muffled by a neoprene sleeve, snapping photos of the renovations, which were actually systematic destructions of filing cabinets. They reached the sub-basement vault, a heavy iron door that predated the town's incorporation. It wasn't modern, but it was sturdy. "Cade, watch the stairs," Elijah commanded. The dog positioned himself at the base of the stairwell, his head low, his amber eyes fixed on the sliver of light from the door above. Elijah turned his attention to the vault's dial. This wasn't a job for a crowbar. He closed his eyes, his fingers, thick and scarred from his time in the service, resting lightly on the cold steel. He wasn't a locksmith, but he understood mechanics and the subtle feedback of tension, a skill he'd picked up during breach training. Beside him, Cassian held her breath, her glasses fogging in the cold. After a tense 5 minutes marked only by the distant scrape of wind against the building, a heavy clack echoed through the chamber. The door groaned open. The interior of the vault was a chaotic tomb of history. Boxes were overturned, their contents spilled like entrails across the floor. Someone had already been here, but they had been rushed. Elijah and Cassian began a frantic search, their hands moving through yellowed parchment and brittle ledgers. It was Cade who found it. The dog didn't bark. He moved to a corner where a heavy mahogany desk had been pushed aside, revealing a loose floorboard. He pawed at it once, then looked at Elijah. Underneath the board lay a leather-bound folio, its surface embossed with a faint Irish harp, Maeve's family crest. Inside was the original land grant, a document signed in 1894, untouched by the fraudulent amendments Evergreen had, filed at the county level. It was the silver bullet Chief Rodriguez had spoken of. "This is it," Cassian whispered, her voice trembling. "This proves the entire ridge belongs to the O'Connell Trust. Evergreen's deeds are total forgeries." Suddenly, Cade's low growl turned into a sharp, warning bark. From the floor above, the heavy thud of boots and the crackle of a radio shattered the silence. "Silas," Elijah muttered. The reclamation team hadn't just been sent to the mountain, they were scrubbing the town too. Elijah grabbed the folio and stuffed it into his jacket, grabbing Cassian by the arm. "We have to move, now!" They didn't go back out the basement door. Elijah led them through a narrow coal chute that opened into a cluttered side yard overgrown with frozen ivy. They burst out into the frigid night just as Silas's black SUV screeched into the alleyway. Silas himself stepped out, his tea-colored eyes catching the glint of Elijah's flashlight. He didn't reach for a weapon yet. He simply smiled, that thin-lipped, unnatural sneer that promised a slow end. "You just turned a property dispute into a felony burglary, Vance," Silas called out, his oily baritone echoing off the brick walls. Elijah didn't waste breath on a retort. He whistled for Cade, and the three of them vanished into the dense, swirling fog of the town square before Silas's men could deploy. They reached the Land Cruiser, hidden blocks away, the engine turning over with a defiant roar. As they sped away from the town center, Cassian clutching her camera like a holy relic, Elijah realized the game had changed. They had the truth, but they were now fugitives in a town owned by the lie. The ridge was no longer just a home, it was the final fortress. As the mountain loomed ahead, a dark, jagged silhouette against the pre-dawn gray, Elijah looked at the land grant on the seat beside him. The paper was thin, but in his hands, it felt as heavy and powerful as a loaded rifle. The pre-dawn light that filtered through the thick canopy of the Appalachian ridge was not the herald of a new beginning, but a cold, sickly gray that seemed to drain the color from the world. Elijah Vance pushed the Land Cruiser through the final treacherous ascent to his cabin, the engine ticking with heat as it fought against the thinning oxygen and frozen grade. Beat him, Cassian Hayes was frantically scrolling through her camera's digital display, her auburn curls a wild halo of static electricity against the headrest. The leather folio containing the 1894 land grant sat on the dashboard, a physical anchor in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. As they reached the clearing, the cabin stood silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. The smell of wood smoke was thinner, and Cade's low vibrating growl from the back seat told Elijah that the mountain was no longer a secret sanctuary. Boone Bear Halloway stepped off the porch as they approached, his double-bitted axe resting in the crook of his massive arm. His hazel eyes were narrowed, scanning the tree line with a grim intensity that mirrored Elijah's own. "They've started the broadcast, Vance," Boone said, his voice a dry rasp. He nodded toward the small battery-operated radio sitting on the porch railing. "The county sheriff is calling it an armed abduction. They've put your face on every screen from here to Charleston. You're not just a hermit anymore, you're a domestic terrorist." Elijah's jaw tightened, the muscles flaring along his scarred cheek. Silas Thorne hadn't waited for the law to catch up. He had manufactured a reality where the law worked for him. By turning a document recovery into a kidnapping, Silas had effectively cut off Elijah's ability to seek help from anyone but the mountain itself. As they ushered Cassian inside, they were met by a new presence standing near the hearth. This was Gage Holloway, a man who stood in stark contrast to his brother Boone. Gage was 58, a man of refined edges and expensive, climate-controlled comfort. He was slightly shorter than Boone, but carried a dignified, silver-haired authority. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a soft, pampered jawline, and he wore a tailored wool overcoat that looked tragically out of place against the cabin's cedar walls. Gage was a retired circuit court judge, a man who had spent his life navigating the clean, well-lit corridors of the law until a scandal involving administrative discrepancies had forced him into a quiet, albeit wealthy, exile. Unlike the rugged Boone, Gage was a creature of intellect and influence, possessing a sharp, cynical tongue and a deep-seated resentment for the corporate machines that had eventually discarded him. "It's a classic pincer maneuver, Elijah," Gage said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that sounded like aged brandy. He didn't look up from the legal pad he was scribbling on. "Silas has leveraged the disappearance of Mrs. O'Connell to trigger an emergency conservatorship. Legally, the state now views her as a vulnerable adult in the hands of an unstable veteran. Anything you say or produce, including that land grant, will be dismissed as the fruit of a criminal act. They don't need to win the argument, they just need to invalidate the messenger." Elijah leaned against the mantel, his steel blue eyes locking on to the disgraced judge. "I didn't bring you here for a lecture on how I'm losing, Gage. I brought you here because you know where the cracks in their foundation are." Gage finally looked up, a thin, sardonic smile touching his lips. "The crack, my dear boy, is the timeline. Silas is moving too fast. He's filed the injunction, but the digital signatures on the county's version of the deed have a timestamp that conflicts with the Historical Society's renovation permits. If we can get Cassian's photos and that land grant to a federal magistrate outside this district, the whole house of Hussey cards collapses. But Silas knows that too, which is why he's not waiting for a warrant." As if on cue, the silence of the ridge was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thrum of rotors. A black civilian helicopter, bearing the discreet but unmistakable evergreen logo, crested the ridge, its searchlight bathing the cabin in a blinding, artificial noon. Outside, the forest erupted in sound. Not the wind, but the synchronized movement of men. Silas had moved beyond reclamation teams. He had deployed a full-scale private security detail. The psychological siege had begun. "Maeve, into the crawl space," Elijah commanded, his voice a steady tactical snap. He looked at Cade, whose hackles were a stiff ridge of mahogany fur. "Boone, Gage, Cassian, get to the back of the cabin. The walls are reinforced with stone there." Suddenly, the cabin's power went dead. The hum of the refrigerator and the glow of the few lamps vanished, leaving them in the flickering orange half-light of the dying fire. A voice amplified by a megaphone boomed from the darkness outside. It was Silas, his oily baritone distorted but recognizable. "Elijah Vance, you have 10 minutes to release Mrs. O'Connell and the stolen property. We have local law enforcement on standby. Don't make this a tragedy for a cause that's already dead." Elijah peered through a slit in the shutters. In the distance, he could see the flashing blue and red lights of a few sheriff's cruisers, parked far back, held at bay by Silas's men. Silas wasn't just surrounding the cabin. He was using the legitimate police as a backdrop for his own private execution. He was creating a theater of conflict where Elijah was the villain, and any defense he offered would be framed as an attack on the law. "He's cutting the comms," Cassian whispered, staring at her dead phone. "I can't upload the photos." "He's not just cutting comms," Elijah said, his eyes scanning the thermal perimeter sensors on his wrist display. "He's narrowing the exits. He wants us to bolt. He wants a chase through the snow, where he can claim we resisted and disappeared into a ravine." He turned to Cade, the dog's amber eyes shining with a fierce, ready light. The stone Vance of the past would have waited for the breach, but the ranger knew that a static defense was a slow death. They had the evidence, and they had the judge to verify it. Now, they just needed to survive the night in a world that had been told they were already ghosts. Elijah grabbed his tactical vest, the ceramic plates clicking into place. He looked at the land grant one last time. It was just a piece of paper, but as the first flashbang grenade detonated in the yard, filling the room with a blinding white light and a deafening roar, Elijah realized it was the only thing left worth dying for. The siege was no longer a threat. It was a reality, and the mountain was about to witness a war it hadn't seen in over a century. The cabin was no longer a home. It had become a wooden pressure cooker. Outside, the world was a chaotic strobe of white searchlights and the concussive, chest-thumping beat of the Evergreen helicopter's rotors. The flashbang's resonance still hummed in Elijah's ears, a high-pitched ringing that he systematically pushed to the periphery of his consciousness. He moved through the smoky half-light of the interior, his night vision optics flipped down, turning the room into a surreal landscape of neon green and deep shadows. He could feel the heat from the dying hearth on his left, and the creeping jagged cold from the shattered window on his right. The air was thick with the metallic tang of spent magnesium and the earthy scent of churned-up snow. "Gage, take the folio and the camera. You and Cassian follow Boone through the root cellar's service tunnel," Elijah commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the external roar. He checked the action on his primary weapon, the cold steel a grounding weight in his hands. He wasn't planning on a massacre. He was planning a distraction. "That tunnel comes out 200 yards down slope near the old charcoal kiln. It's tight, it's damp, and it hasn't been used in 40 years, but it's the only blind spot in Silas's perimeter." Boone Bear Halloway nodded, his massive frame hunched as he pried up the heavy oak floorboards near the larder. He looked at Elijah, his hazel eyes gleaming with a somber, silent understanding. This was the mountain's price. To save the soul of the ridge, they had to bleed for it. "We'll be at the kiln, Vance. Don't make us wait too long," Boone rumbled before disappearing into the dark, earthy maw of the tunnel, followed by a trembling but resolute Cassian and a grumbling Gage Holloway. Elijah turned to his final companion. Cade was standing by the rear door, his powerful legs coiled like steel springs, his mahogany fur bristling. The Malinois wasn't cowering, he was vibrating with a controlled, predatory focus. He looked at Elijah, his amber eyes reflecting the green glow of the night vision HUD. And in that moment, the man and the dog were no longer separate entities. They were a single weapon system. "Ready, boy?" Elijah whispered. Cade responded with a short, sharp exhale, a tactical acknowledgement. Elijah didn't wait for Silas to initiate the breach. He kicked the rear door open and threw a series of smoke canisters into the yard. Thick gray plumes erupted, swallowing the searchlights and turning the clearing into a soup of obscured visibility. He and Cade vanished into the haze. Elijah moved with the silent, predatory fluidity of a ghost, utilizing the stacks of cordwood and the shadows of the porch as cover. He saw them through his thermals, 4 contractors in high-end tactical gear, moving in a stack toward the front entrance. They were arrogant, relying on their technology and the assumption that their target was cornered. Suddenly, a new element entered the fray. From the darkness of the tree line, a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks echoed, not the heavy report of a rifle, but the unmistakable snap of a high-tension compound bow. One of Silas's men went down, a blunt-tipped arrow striking his shoulder, with enough force to spin him around. This was the work of Hunter Ghost Reed. Hunter was a man of 32, a former Olympic-level archer whose career had ended after a tragic hunting accident involving his younger brother, an event that had turned him into a silent, guilt-ridden recluse on the neighboring peak. He was lean and sinewy, his movements as economical as a predator's. His face was narrow and clean-shaven, save for a thin, vertical scar that split his lower lip. He lived in the high altitudes, away from the town's corruption, but he owed Boone his life from a winter 5 years prior. His intervention was the wild card Silas hadn't accounted for. "Target distracted, move!" Elijah's voice crackled over the low-frequency radio he'd given Boone. Elijah and Cade circled the cabin, coming up behind the remaining contractors. Cade was a blur of teeth and muscle, taking down the rear guard with a precision strike to the thigh, his weight slamming the man into the frozen earth. Elijah engaged the other two, his movements a masterclass in close-quarters combat. He didn't fire. He used the butt of his weapon and his boots, a whirlwind of kinetic energy that neutralized the threat before they could even reorient their optics. As the helicopter banked for another pass, its spotlight swinging toward the smoke-filled yard, Silas's voice boomed again, no longer oily but jagged with rage. "Vance, you're dead! You hear me? The whole mountain is going to burn!" Just then, the smell hit Elijah, not smoke, but accelerant. Silas's men hadn't just come to capture, they had brought incendiaries. A bright, searing orange flare arced from the helicopter's side, landing squarely on the cabin's cedar shingle roof. Within seconds, the dry wood caught, the flames licking upward, turning the sanctuary into a funeral pyre. "The kiln, Cade, go!" Elijah yelled. They sprinted down the slope, the heat at their backs and the cold air searing their lungs. The snow was deep, but they moved with the desperation of the damned. They reached the charcoal kiln, a stone dome half buried in the hillside, just as Boone and the others emerged from the tunnel. Gage was clutching the folio as if it were his own life, his tailored coat shredded and covered in mud. "We have to move," Cassian gasped, pointing toward the valley. "If we can reach the main highway, Chief Rodriguez said she'd have a federal escort waiting near the county line." Elijah looked back at the ridge. His cabin was now a beacon of fire against the black Appalachian sky, a sacrifice to the truth. The mountain was watching, its silence now heavy with the weight of the conflict. Silas's helicopter was hovering over the fire, a mechanical vulture, but it had lost the trail. They were under the canopy now, moving through the deep, ancient shadows where technology mattered less than instinct. "Hunter is covering our rear," Elijah said, his eyes meeting Boone's. "But Silas will have the roads blocked. We take the old creek bed. It's frozen solid, but it'll keep us low." As they began the final, grueling trek toward the highway, Elijah felt a strange sense of clarity. He had lost his home, his solitude, and his peace. But as he looked at Maeve, who was being carried gently by Boone, and Cade, who was leading the way with ears pricked, he knew the fire hadn't destroyed everything. It had forged a brotherhood. The 1894 land grant was still safe, and as long as that paper existed, the ridge still had a heart. The night was far from over, but the Stone Vance who had sought to disappear had finally found something worth being seen for. The descent through the frozen creek bed was a grueling odyssey of grit and ice. Elijah Vance led the procession, his boots finding purchase on the slick, treacherous rocks with the instinctual certainty of a mountain goat. Behind him, Boone carried Maeve like a precious relic, her weight negligible against his massive, timber-hewn frame. Cassian and Gage followed, their breath coming in ragged, white plumes that vanished into the dark, oppressive canopy of the Appalachian hemlocks. Cade moved ahead of them all, his mahogany coat a dark shadow against the snow, his ears swiveling toward the distant, receding thrum of the helicopter. The cold was a living thing here, a sharp, biting presence that turned sweat into needles and sapped the warmth from their bones. Yet the adrenaline of the escape acted as a thin, vibrating shield against the sub-zero reality. As they neared the county line highway, the forest began to thin, revealing the silver ribbon of asphalt illuminated by the flickering amber light of distant street lamps. Elijah signaled for a halt, his hand raised, his steel-blue eyes scanning the embankment. The road should have been empty, but a single, sleek vehicle sat idling near the bridge. This was not a police cruiser or a black SUV. It was a silver Chevrolet Suburban with blackened windows and federal plates. Standing beside it was Special Agent Marcus Sterling. Marcus was 42, a man who possessed the lean, coiled intensity of a greyhound. He was sharply dressed in a tactical windbreaker and dark trousers, his face a collection of hard, unforgiving lines, and a jaw so precisely shaven it looked like it had been honed by a razor. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and observational, reflecting a career spent dismantled corporate racketeering rings from the inside. Marcus was a man of absolute protocol, a contrast to Elijah's rugged pragmatism, but he carried a debt to Chief Rodriguez, one that had finally been called in to bypass the local corruption of Maple Creek. "Chief Rodriguez said you'd have the silver bullet, Vance," Sterling said, his voice a crisp professional monotone that cut through the mountain wind. He didn't look at the burning ridge behind them. He looked only at the leather folio Gage Holloway was clutching. Before Gage could respond, the screech of tires echoed from the north. Silas Thorne hadn't given up. Two black F-150s roared over the crest of the hill, their high beams blinding as they swerved to block the highway. Silas stepped out of the lead vehicle, his obsidian jacket tattered from the brush, his goatee disheveled, and his tea-colored eyes burning with a manic, desperate fury. He looked at the federal plates on Sterling's car, and for the first time, the oily confidence in his expression wavered, replaced by a raw, cornered aggression. "Agent Sterling, I presume?" Silas called out, his voice cracking with a jagged edge. "You're interfering in a local felony abduction. That man," he pointed a trembling finger at Elijah, "is a domestic threat. Hand over the woman and the stolen files, or this becomes a jurisdictional tragedy." Sterling didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and produced a digital tablet, flicking a screen towards Silas. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, I'm here to execute a federal seizure warrant for Evergreen Properties servers. It seems a journalist named Cassian Hayes has been quite busy uploading metadata from the Historical Society's renovations to a cloud server we've been monitoring for hours." He nodded toward Cassian, who stood behind Elijah, a defiant, weary smile on her face. "The 1894 land grant in Mr. Vance's possession isn't just a deed, it's the final piece of a RICO indictment. You're not reclaiming property, Silas. You're obstructing a federal investigation." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of Silas's radio. The theater Silas had created had collapsed. The local sheriff's deputies, seeing the federal presence and the overwhelming evidence of the fire on the ridge, began to disarm the private contractors. Silas looked at Elijah, the man he had thought was just a broken hermit, and saw the face of the warrior who had outplayed him at every turn. Silas was handcuffed against the hood of his own truck, his corporate empire dissolving into the freezing mountain air. The happy ending. Weeks passed, and the mountain began to exhale as the first tentative signs of spring touched the Thung Lung. The snow retreated, revealing the green, resilient shoots of mountain laurel. While Elijah's cabin was gone, the community of Maple Creek had undergone a transformation that no fire could touch. The Evergreen scandal had purged the town council, and with Chief Rodriguez's leadership, a new sense of transparency had taken root. Maeve O'Connell sat on the freshly painted porch of her cedar-sided home, the 1894 deed now framed and hanging proudly in her hallway. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was the heart of the ridge. Beside her, Cade lay stretched out in the sun, his mahogany fur gleaming, his front leg healed enough that the limp was barely a memory. He let out a contented sigh as a young boy from town, one of Maeve's new students in her porch-side library, reached out to scratch his ears. Elijah Vance stood near the tree line, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in a decade. He wasn't living in a cellar or a tent. With the help of Boone, Hunter, and even Gage, who had found a new purpose providing pro bono legal aid to the town's elders, a new cabin was rising on the ridge. It was larger, with more windows to let in the light, and a room specifically designed for a library. Elijah looked at the scar on his hand, then at the bustling, peaceful scene on Maeve's porch. He realized that the stone Vance who had sought to disappear had died in the fire, and the man who stood here now was a neighbor, a friend, and a guardian, the Appalachian. Mountain held many secrets, but the story of the ranger, the teacher, and the dog became a new legend in Maple Creek. It was a story of a paper that was stronger than iron, and a fire that, instead of destroying, had cleared the path for the truth to grow. As the sun set over the peaks, casting a warm, golden glow across the valley, Elijah whistled for Cade. The dog bounded toward him, and together they walked toward the new home they had built, not just out of wood and stone, but out of faith in the unbreakable bonds of a mountain that finally knew peace. In the heart of the coldest blizzard, we learn that a miracle isn't always a grand gesture from the heavens. Sometimes it is the quiet strength God places in the heart of a stranger who chooses to stay when the world walks away. Just as the 1894 deed survived the fire, your faith can withstand any trial if you trust in the divine timing of your life. In your daily walk, remember that you might be the answer to someone else's prayer today. A kind word, a helping hand, or simply standing for the truth can be the lighthouse someone needs in their storm. If this story touched your soul, please share it to spread hope, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to our channel for more journeys of faith. May the Lord bless you and keep you, bringing warmth to your home and peace to your spirit. God bless you all.